Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm honoured to be speaking with sports psychologist Dr. Steve Bull. Steve, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hello there, Dan, and thanks very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I am so super excited. So the Sports Psych Show audience know, I got in contact with Steve recently. I didn't know if he was going to answer my request because he's such a legend in the world of sports psychology here in Britain and globally. And so I'm going to be a real fanboy today, having been a real anorak of sports psychology when I was a teenager. And Steve's book, The Mental Game Plan, amongst all the books he's written, it was one of the first ones I picked up as a young, aspiring sports psychologist. I think it would be a great start. I know you go way back with regard your sports psychology career, Steve. Why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show?
I sure will. And firstly, thanks for your kind words for the intro, Dan, and much appreciated. Yes, well, as you've intimated, I do go back a fair old while. I actually started my professional life as a PE teacher back in the early 1980s, which was a career that was quite popular for people who were really committed and involved or wanted to be involved in sport. This was before professional coaching really took off in the UK. So if you were into your sport but you weren't a professional performer, PE teacher was an obvious place to go. And this was before sports science as an undergraduate discipline became established. So that's where I started. I only taught for a couple of years and then kind of felt a bit of an itch to do further study. And having worked in America at a summer camp during my university days and enjoyed spending time in North America, fancy going back out, which again was quite a common route back in those days for people who wanted to pursue postgraduate study within sport. It was quite common to go to North America. Sports psychology didn't exist. I'd actually never heard of sports psychology, even though I was a PE teacher. But I was interested in studying, so I went back to one of my university lecturers for some recommendations. He gave me a recommended university to study at in Canada, Queen's University, because he had a sabbatical there. And I was fortunate to get a place, and off I went. When I arrived there, I didn't know which part of sports studies I wanted to specialise in. Met the chair of graduate studies, and we started chatting, and he introduced me to the idea of working with a guy called John Albinson, who was a psychologist who'd just come back from the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. So I arrived on Canadian soil in September 84. John had just got back from working at the LA Games with the Canadian team, and he was allocated as my psychology. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what sports psychologists did. And he talked about the role that he'd had with the Canadian team just a month before. And I was captured immediately. I was fascinated. I thought, this is right up my street. So he and I ended up working together. Got my master's, stayed working with him. We did some writing together. And then I came back to the UK after a year or two and got a job in the higher education world, Brighton Polytechnic at the time, which subsequently became the University of Brighton. Did a PhD in the late 80s, and that was just at the time in the UK when sports psych was starting to take hold, but there weren't many of us. I would say you could probably count the number of active sports psychologists back in those days on two hands, maybe three. So it was the Wild West of sports psychology, if you like, but it was an exciting time to be around. So from that point on, I kind of had three careers that ran concurrently. There was about 15 or so years working in academia, getting my PhD, being a lecturer, supervising PhD students, doing research, writing, publications. And then at the same time, there was the consulting work when applied sports psychology was just starting to take off. Funding from the what was the Sports Council in those days was freed up for sports science support programs. I was involved right in the early days of that. So started to get some experience as a sports psych consultant. And then some years later, migrated, as many of us have done, into the business world and ended up applying a lot of the sports psych principles with business clients. So those three roles that have overlapped, that's basically what I've been doing for the last 35 years. These days, I've moved away from sport, and the little work that I do these days is exclusively in the business world, which is a mixture of one-to-one exec coaching, working with senior leadership teams, and a fair bit of speaking.
Let's get in a time machine, go back to the mid to late 80s. You came back after doing your masters in Canada and working out there with John Albenson. You took up that position at Brighton, and obviously you entered academia, so as the research and the teaching side of things. I'm curious as to what kind of reception you used to have from a consultancy perspective. I guess where my head is here is there must have been a great degree of skepticism back there around sports psychology.
That's an understatement. I don't in any way want this to sound like a sob story, but it was quite tough. Because it was tough and at the same time really quite frustrating, because back in those days, because of the inherent skepticism, you basically had to spend half of your time selling your wares, trying to convince people that this stuff would add value. You spent as much time doing that as you did then trying to help them after you've managed to convince them. So you had to work really hard at that. And I've often said over the years that back in those days, any team or any group of athletes or coaches for that matter that you were put in front of, you could pretty much characterize them into four groups. And it was probably 25%, 25, 25, 25. So 25% of the people in front of you basically just had the instant reaction of, this stuff's a load of rubbish. Why am I here? I need to be out practicing my sport. This is a waste of time. Not interested. That was probably a quarter of the group. The next quarter were probably sitting there saying, yeah, I can see that this stuff might have a role to play with some athletes, but I don't need it. I'm fine. So this sports psych stuff is for others. You know, perhaps the athletes who are perceived to be, weak and, haven't got that killer instinct and all that kind of macho stuff. So yes, I can accept it, but it's not for me. So that's half your group out of the picture before you've even started. The next 25% are probably sitting there with their arms folded thinking, all right, I'll listen. I'm not convinced, but I've got a quasi-open mind. Yeah. See what he's got to say. And then the final 25%, that you've got them pretty quickly. They get it, they like it, they're interested, they want to work with you, and away you go. But it would certainly be no more than 25% best case scenario. So that was the challenge initially. And it wasn't just about your personal credibility, although that was a big part of it. Because, of course, back then you had this really strong view, certainly in professional sports, that went along the lines of, well, you haven't played professional sport, well, you haven't been to the Olympics, so how can you possibly advise me on managing the pressures of my high-performance world? That was a big, so there was a hurdle to get over. So there was the personal credibility thing, but there was also, the subject credibility. People just didn't buy it. They just didn't understand it. They just couldn't see how it was going to add value. So you had to work quite hard to get that message through to at least half, if not 3/4 of the people sitting in front of you. So sob story over. It was a different world back then. And I suppose the final thing I'd say on that, which was the added challenge, was you didn't get very much time, basically. And there's two ways I could interpret that statement. One is you didn't get much time in that if you didn't grab them quickly, you weren't invited back. But secondly, even if you were invited back, and let's say you were lucky enough to get a year's contract to work with a team, the number of days that you got was absolutely minimal. I mean, even if you wind the clock onwards, let's wind the clock onwards 10 years or so from, let's say, go to the late 90s. I mean, I started working with the England men's cricket team in 1997, and that was after 10 years of working with the England women's team. But after working with the men's team for a year or two, I was given a contract by the England and Wales Cricket Board. And the contract, it was an annual contract, and it was to work with the England men's team, the England, what in those days was called the A team, which would now be the Lions team, the under-19 team, and a little bit of coach ed work. So I'll say that again, the senior England men's team, the under-19 team, what is now the Lions, and some coach ed work. And I had 60 days a year to cover all of that. And that was a brilliant contract. I mean, that was an exciting number of days to have. Well, I mean, these days, you'd probably feel a bit miffed if you didn't have 100 days just with the senior team. So, you know, you had to really make your time count. I mean, basically, times have changed for the better. But as an oldster, you sometimes sit back and think, oh, wouldn't it be great to be able to approach your work in a more relaxed fashion and not feel under pressure to have that impact so quickly?
Do you think that pressure, the constraint, the time constraint that you had, almost paradoxically helped you to become a better consultant because you had to be industrious and creative? You had to find those pockets of time with players, with the team, and make them count.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting take. I mean, probably it would be my initial answer. Because, yeah, you had to make your time count. Yeah. You had to be incredibly well prepared. The flip side of that, though, is that, I mean, I've made lots of mistakes during my career, but one of the mistakes you could very easily get sucked into back in those days when you had far fewer days to work on is intervening when you shouldn't. You know, that's always been one of the great challenges of being a sports psychologist. And I remember being given that advice very early on in my career, and it was a fantastic bit of advice. And the advice was, you have to get comfortable with not intervening. But back in those days, it was all very new. You felt you had a responsibility towards the profession as well as to yourself to do a good job and forward the profession, if you like. So there was always a tendency to think, well, I've got to be adding value here. I need to intervene. I need to do something. Whereas actually, you know, the best thing would have been hang back, don't intervene. And I learned that as my career developed. I certainly made that mistake, you know, on several occasions early on. But when you've got so few days, there was more likelihood of you making that mistake because you wanted to have an impact. You wanted to intervene. Very
challenging to tell yourself to hang back when you've got limited time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a discipline which I improved enormously on, and it became one of my, later on in my career, when I was asked to give seminars or presentations to people who were starting off in their sports psych career, that was always very high on my list of top tips, if you like. You have to get comfortable. And I think there's a confidence element in that as well. You know, you've got to have the confidence to hold back and not intervene, particularly moving on from cricket, if you think about working at the Olympic Games. Because there it's such an intense pressurized environment which doesn't last that long. There is a real danger of you intervening when you shouldn't. I mean, I always felt having worked at 3 Olympic Games, there was a much greater chance of making the mistake of doing too much rather than the mistake of not doing enough. So I used to set myself the goal in my head of saying, look, if I'm going to get it wrong here, I want to get it wrong by not intervening as opposed to get it wrong by intervening. But there's a discipline associated with that, and I do also think there's a confidence. And I felt as my career progressed, the more confident I felt in my abilities as a sports psychologist, the easier it became to hold back and wait for those coachable moments.
And I myself find myself a lot utilising my self-talk, if you like, and saying to myself, don't do it, don't say it, walk away, or don't even walk over, don't walk over. You know, it's, I suppose it's practicing what you preach to a degree. And I mean, we'll talk about today's landscape in a bit, and I do want to talk about the Olympic Games, but we're obviously talking about sports psychology 20, 30 years ago when you guys were perennially trying to prove yourself, and there still feels an element of that even today. I mean, hey Steve, maybe it's my paranoia, but there still feels an element of that today, but we'll come on to that. One question I did want to ask you before we move on is, in the face of such protestation, in the face of people, as you said, almost 75% of the 100% are either going, no rubbish, or I was saying, well, not for me, I'm not weak-minded, or are potentially saying, well, you know, I'll listen, but prove it to me. Did you ever doubt yourself? Did you, not so much did you doubt yourself, did you doubt your subject matter at any stage in that early 90s, late 80s?
I can honestly say, Dan, I don't think I ever did. I really, really believed in the subject matter. That said, I was acutely aware of the fact that it was easy to make the mistake of applying the wrong bit of the subject matter at the wrong time. So I often used to say in the old days, when you read, I mean, this would probably still be to some extent true today, but certainly back in those days, when you would read about what a sports psychologist did with an athlete, if you weren't involved, you might read that and say, well, that's obvious, isn't it? I mean, crumbs, why have you got to do a PhD to do that? You know, that's, yeah, easy. I could have done that. Yeah. And my response to that was, when you're actually looking at that one specific intervention, yes, it looked really, really obvious, but the skill was in choosing that one obvious intervention from 25 other obvious interventions. But you've got to pick the right one of the 25 and apply it and deliver it, communicate it in the right way, at the right time, in a manner that that athlete will receive it and then take it on board. And when you come out that process the other end, it all looks really easy and obvious. But getting to that point where the athlete turns around and says, yeah, that was helpful, I did X, that's more complicated. Coming back to your question, did I doubt the subject matter? No. But I used to think very carefully about which bits of the subject matter to apply as and when, because I never believed that all of the sports psych content was going to work for everyone. And I was pretty clear about that. And that was a message I would give often in my introductory talks to athletes. And it was one of the ways that I would get around some of the resistance, was to say, look, not all of this is going to work for you. You know, hopefully you'll all be able to take different bits from it. But I stand here in front of you with no expectation that you'll appreciate how all of this, or ever end up using all of this material. Let's see if we can work together to find the bits of it that will help you.
I'm going to do a little bit of a Billy Connolly tangent here, because I want to pick up on something that you said, because I do want to come back into the Olympics and the cricket and what have you, but you said the skill of sports psychology, maybe the craft of sports psychology consultancy, is potentially picking the right intervention for the right person at the right time, etc., etc. And as you know, there are almost every coach, certainly at the adult elite level, but by and large across the board, would say, hey, you the sports psych, I want you to come in and I want you to work with my coaches to help my coaches deliver better on the psychological side of things, which I'm all in favour for, and that we believe in the industry that is arguably the most efficacious way to do it, because the psychologists are at the the coaches are at the ground level, they've got the boots on, the cleats on, whatever, and they can do great psychology within their work. But as you say, it's a real craft, it's challenging, it's tough, it requires a great deal of expertise. As I always say, my dad was a London taxi driver for 50 years. If you ask him to get from King's Cross to Piccadilly, he can tell you 15 different ways to get there from one place to another, and if he got stuck in traffic, he'd know the shortcuts and what have you. And this is what I've always wrestled with, is I recognise and I understand that we need to do our work through the coaches, with the coaches and through the coaches. Yet at the same time, I don't want to belittle the craft of sports psychology. The sports psychologist having access to players, I think, is vital as well. I don't think there's a question in there. I would just appreciate your comment on what I've just said.
Well, firstly, I agree with your analysis. But there's a couple of things I'd say. I too am a great believer in working through the coaches. That said, that doesn't necessarily suggest that there isn't plenty that a sports psychologist can do with the athletes. In fact, I've often said throughout my career that the more the profession of sports psychology progresses, the more coaches will end up learning about sports psychology in their training. And the more they can learn and the more sports psych stuff they can incorporate into their work, then that frees us up to do what you might describe as even more advanced psych stuff when we work with the athletes. So again, let's take an historical perspective on this. If you go back to the 1980s, I mean, I remember doing some unbelievably basic stuff with athletes around things like goal setting, self-talk, pre-performance routines, really, really impactful but very basic stuff. Now, those three things that I've just mentioned, my belief now is they should be an absolutely integral part of a coach's education. No, you don't have to be a psychologist to do good goal setting with athletes or teach them about pre-performance routines or do some, positive self-talk with them. But that's what we used to do back in those days. But as coach education has developed over the last 30 or 40 years, the quality of education coaches now get compared with back in the 80s, I mean, it's indescribably different. Great. So let them cover that stuff and we can move things on even further by doing more advanced sports psych with the athletes. The other thing, again, historical difference, is back in the 80s and into the 90s, the idea of working with and through the coach was way less common than it is now. In fact, what you'd often get back in those days, and I never felt comfortable with this, but it was really common, the coach would invite you in, but then very much treat you at arm's length. So, okay, this is your domain. It's almost like, I don't want to hear any of this. It's almost like they're holding their hands up to their ears saying, I don't want all this psychobabble, but you're in here, so you go and do your work with the athletes. And I have worked in those sort of contexts on numerous occasions. In the latter stages of my career, I would refuse to take a contract if that was the case. I would only take a job if I was going to be able to work closely with the coach. If you took that stance in the 80s, you wouldn't have had any work. But that's changed fundamentally, thankfully. So coming back to your point, I think it is possible to work with and through the coaches, but also have a role to play with the athletes as well.
I think what I hear there is it's important for us in sports psychology to help the coaches understand the importance of an integrated process that travels from work with the coaches and through the coaches through to the necessity of more complex, isolated work between athlete and sports psychologist.
Exactly. And the one thing I'd add on that, though, coming back to working with and through the coaches, as I'm sure your listeners will readily appreciate, there's at least two different ways in which you'd be working with the coach. Number one, working with the coach to help them understand their players and help them in their coaching efficiency with those players. But then number two, it's helping the coach, because the coach is the performer as well, and the coach experiences pressure, and the coach has to manage themselves well and effectively, irrespective of what the athletes are doing. So you are supporting the coach in the way that you would support an athlete as well. Now, those are two different ways of working. And I've had experiences in the past where it's been predominantly one or predominantly other, or sometimes both. But it's a different way of working when you're sitting down with a coach and specifically helping them work with players versus forget the players, let's just help you and support you in this moment, if you like. They're two different things.
And I assume a lot of the work you did at Olympic level, you would have been doing some of the stuff you've spoken, or all of the stuff you've spoken about there, with coaches. I'm sorry, Steve, remind me, you're a veteran of how many Olympic Games?
3, 1 winter, 2 summer.
Right, okay. And, I mean, for our audience, what does that look like? What does, you're there, you've probably been involved in the training cycle leading up to that once every 4 year spectacular event, whether it's winter or summer. Once you're there in camp, in the Olympic Park, what does that role look like?
Well, as you, and I'm sure your readers, listeners would appreciate, there's different types of psychologists that are present at an Olympics. Now, the 3 Olympics that I worked at, I had the same role each time, which was called the British Olympic Association's headquarters psychologist. Now, as a headquarters psychologist, you are not attached to any one team. You are part of the headquarters staff. And you've got several roles within that. Firstly, you are there, and these are not in order of priority, by the way, but one of your roles is to be there to support athletes who do not have a team psychologist with them. Secondly, you are there to provide a sort of almost like a drop-in service for the entire duration for coaches, for athletes, from any sport, just if they want to drop in and talk about some stuff, or a couple of coaches might get together and say, look, we'd like you to run a couple of hour session on some aspect of sports psych. Our athletes are going to be performing in 10 days time. We'd like you to do a couple of hours on X. Could you set up a mini sort of learning workshop-y sort of thing? So that was part of the role. But then a very significant part of the headquarters role is to provide psych support for all of the staff. So that might be coaches, but it also might be team physios, team doctors, team analysts. It might be people working in the BOA back office. Everyone who works at an Olympic Games is under immense pressure to perform. Even if, the role, is an administrative one, or you're in charge of the kit, or whatever it is you're in charge of, it's pressure, it's long working days. So I often reflect on my 3 Olympics, and if I think about how I divvied up my time, I probably ended up spending considerably more time working with non-athletes than I did with athletes. Now, that was partly because I wasn't officially linked with any team in particular, and a number of teams had their own sports psychs. But it was also evidence to me that it isn't just the athletes that are under pressure here. Everyone is. And I spend huge quantities of time working with people behind the scenes that most viewers are not even aware are there. but they're having to perform, and they're constantly on a daily basis dealing with stuff that comes up, and it's usually some sort of emergency, and that takes its toll.
And would I be right in thinking that maybe where that landscape has changed over the last 2 decades is, certainly in the British team, just about every Olympic sport will now have a strong Olympic team will have a strong sports psychology presence?
Yeah, I don't know what the latest setup is in terms of how many or what proportion of teams have their own psychologists, but certainly over time that grew and grew as time went on. My first Olympics was the Winter Games back in 1994, and there was one other psychologist there other than myself in the headquarters role. And then when I did the Sydney Olympics, I wasn't actually based in at the Olympic Village. There was someone else, Lou Hardy was based down there, but I was based for the duration in the holding camp on the Gold Coast. Now, we had a few other sports psychologists who dropped in and out of that holding camp, but not many compared with what you would have around now. So the landscape looks very different. I would still say, even if I don't think this would be the case now, but even if every team took their own psychologist, there would still be, in my view, a role for the HQ psych to support everyone else. And indeed, sometimes to provide peer support for the psychs.
Yeah, I agree.
I can remember having some conversations with some of the team psychs who were having to work through some really challenging issues, who benefited from a little bit of peer supervision. That's a helpful role too.
When you reflect back with that acute pressure, there must have been, do you remember quite a few last-minute interventions with athletes?
Yeah, at the Olympics, it's very much day by day, in the moment. You get up in the morning, it's going to be a very long day. You have no idea what's going to happen, but something's going to happen somewhere along the line, and there will be a need for some sort of intervention and action. Still got to be mindful of what we discussed earlier, which is not diving in too early. But it's very much day by day. A lot of it is firefighting. It's firefighting psychology, which is incredibly different form of sports psych support than when you're working throughout a season. And indeed, again, let's take an historical perspective. If you go back to when I started in sports psych back in the 80s in North America, and they were probably 10 years ahead of us, maybe 15 back in those days. We caught up in the 90s. But I remember going to lots of workshops and conferences back in the late 80s. And I used to fly back fairly frequently for these conferences. And the theme was often about talking about the difference between what was called on-site sports psych provision versus regular sports psych provision. So the regular stuff is rocking up at training, day by day, week by week, versus, okay, we're at the World Champs, we're at the Olympics. This is different. This is a different sort of sports psych intervention. It's a different methodology, and we used to have lots of workshops where people who would come back from those on-site experiences and talk about mistakes they'd made. There used to be a really great group of sports psychs that the BOA used to run, the what was called the Psychology Advisory Group. We just used to get together every few months and share stories. Some of them success stories, but a lot of them were, look, here's some howling mistakes I've made. I'm going to share this with my peers so that we can all learn from them. There was a great camaraderie back in those days, actually, because it was quite a small group of us. Some of those most memorable sessions were lessons learned from the cock-ups I made at the World Champs. It was a great learning environment.
What kind of again, for the benefit of coaches listening in, I think they'd find it quite interesting when you say the cock-ups one makes as a sports psychologist. I mean, keeping it in general terms, what can that look like, Steve?
Well, that's a difficult one to give a sort of punchy, quick answer to. I mean, as I've said repeatedly, many of them were intervening when you shouldn't have.
Yep.
Trying to do too much, overcomplicating things.
Sure.
I mean, that was very high on my list of mistakes early in my career. No question about it. You know, you come out of a PhD, you've been immersed in research, language, terminology, documentation for years on end, and all of a sudden you start working with athletes. And it took me quite a while to appreciate the the adage of simplicity is the way. And I remember thinking that I was presenting things quite simply, and clearly I wasn't. Because when you do this whole PhD thing and you go along to present your research at conferences, I mean, you'll know what that world is like. I mean, boy, it's hypercritical. You know, it's not a very, in my day, it wasn't a massively supportive kind of environment. People were out to, prove you wrong, spot your errors. You had to be really, really sharp on all of the complex jargon and detail. And all of a sudden, you go and work in an applied environment. Boy, that's a shift in style. And it took me years to dial down on the complexity and realize that keeping things as simple as possible was the way to go. So that would have been a common mistake that we all would have made back in those days. Choosing the wrong intervention. Yep. Thinking obviously here's the way to go on this one. I've got the answers here. In you go. And then the day after you get up and think, no, maybe I should have waited. Another mistake I made, not just at the Olympics, but generally I would say early in my career, was relying too much on what I would call the formal moments of delivery and not realizing quick enough in my career that actually it was the informal moments where you probably did your best work. So what I mean by that is, back in the old days, you would be given your 45-minute slot, whether that be with a team or whether that be with an individual, and that was the sports psych slot. And then you put your professional hat on and you did the best job you could. But then I found out increasingly as my career started to develop that actually it was having a coffee and having that informal chat when all of a sudden you just ease your way into what the athlete might not realize is a kind of work conversation, and then you're dropping in some little hints and tips for them, or even, dare I say, late in the evening over a drink of some description when everyone's relaxed. There isn't that stigma of the session with the psychologist, which back in the old days was really prevalent. Just a relaxed drink, talking about stuff. And I think part of that is they started to see you as human, not as the mad eccentric psychologist who was going to analyze them to death. They saw you as human. You shared a joke. You talked about stuff, and then all of a sudden they're asking your advice. I remember some real pivotal moments with certain athletes in that front, and I wish I'd learnt that earlier.
I think the same can be said for coaches, Steve, if I may say. I almost wonder sometimes if coaches see their coaching role as that hour and a half on the pitch when they're training, if, let's say, it's soccer or football. But I do wonder if a lot of the good coaching is done in the corridors, with those casual conversations in the corridors, but also, as you say, over a coffee. And it's important for coaches to perceive those times as potential coaching moments as well.
Yeah, I'm big on that, huge. I think you would apply that equally to coaching for sure. I mean, that's not to downplay the importance of the formal coaching stuff. Of course, that's important.
Yep.
But the power of those informal moments, whatever your role, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. And as I said, I wish I'd learned earlier in my career the power of saying to an athlete, do you fancy a coffee? Let's go and grab a sandwich and a coffee and let's just have a chat. I wish I'd grasped that earlier in my career.
And yet, sometimes playing in the back of your mind, just being mindful of the look of dread that the athlete has when he's looking at you or she's looking at you, and they're thinking, "Oh, what have I done? Why am I not?" Yeah. So it's that balance, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and that's you mentioned it earlier. I think, Dan, it's the art of sports psychology, which I think is I've always believed, and this has got even stronger in the latter part of my career. I actually think the art of sports psychology, the nature of the human interaction, the relationship that you build with the athlete, is actually vastly more important than the specific content stuff. Often, not always, but often, it's the power of that relationship, the nature of that human interaction, to the extent that, and I'm not the first person to come up with this idea, but it's almost like you are the intervention. You as the practitioner, you are the intervention. Build a strong relationship, establish that trust, and that has a real impact. And the stronger that relationship becomes, I think the less emphasis you need to place on getting the content right. Remember earlier we were talking about so important to choose that one piece of content correctly out of 25. It's that becomes less important later when you've got that really, really strong relationship.
Okay, well, I'd like to actually change tack a little here. And you mentioned earlier, Steve, that you became, I think it was lead psychologist in 1997 for the England cricket team. Well, teams, because there were a number of teams, and you only had 60 days to work with them all. But I know that you historically, since that time, have done some wonderful work with the ECB, that's the English Cricket Board, on sports psychology, and you really pioneered some very forward-thinking work, research on an area that we might call mental toughness, which is a term that resonates with some people and not so much with other people. But I'd like to have a conversation about that and how that started, and I think you very much defined what mental toughness might look like in the heat of battle. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, firstly, to pick up on your comment about the term mental toughness, works for some people and perhaps not for others. I think that's changed over the years. Back in those days, mental toughness was a term that was widely used, both within and outside sports psychology. It's become less so these days. It seems to me resilience is more of a common term, that might, to some people, be synonymous with mental toughness, although others would say they're different. But anyway, yeah, I became really interested and frustrated by the concept of mental toughness back in the late 1990s. I'd worked with the England women's cricket team for 10 years, between 87 and 97. And I'd done 2 or 3 years in men's county cricket, professional cricket, and then started working with the England men's team in 97. And not long after starting that work, this frustration around the term mental toughness really started to rear its head with me. And what I mean by that is I became increasingly frustrated at how the term was being used so loosely and liberally, and how some players were described as being mentally tough and other players were not mentally tough without what I felt was any decent criteria well, why do you think that player is mentally tough? Why do you think that player isn't mentally tough? Commentators would use the term a lot. Coaches would use the term a lot. Selectors would make selections based on their perception of mental toughness without having any degree, what I felt, of understanding of what it really meant. But did any of us know what mental toughness really meant? And then the other thing that really made me think too around that time in the late 90s was I became a bit frustrated at people making an assumption that mental toughness and being a champion were inextricably linked, almost synonymous. If you won a gold medal, then you were mentally tough. And I had come across Olympic medalists who I greatly respected and admired and enjoyed working with and thought they were great people and great professionals. But I didn't actually think they were, beacons of mental toughness. Whereas I came across other athletes who'd never won a medal in their life. But I looked at them, I thought, boy, you are a gritty, mentally tough performer. And that started to frustrate me a bit as well. And then you would get athletes who were invited in to talk to business audiences about their life story. And it was assumed that, well, you've been to the Olympics, therefore you must be mentally tough. And yet some of these athletes were a bag of nerves at the Olympics, understandably so. That's not a criticism. It's a frustration at assuming that successful performance therefore means mental toughness. So all of these things were going around in my head. And I thought, I've never read any really decent research to help people understand what mental toughness is and how we might measure it and how we might use it more productively. So I came up with this idea of doing quite an extensive research study, which Hugh Morris, who was the performance director for the ECB at the time, he was very happy to support, thankfully. So to cut a long story short, I ended up surveying over 100 cricket coaches, experienced cricket coaches, and doing a survey to ask them who they thought were the mentally toughest English cricketers, male cricketers, of the previous decade or so. And I asked them to list their top 10. And then I basically collated all that data, allocating scoring to each name to get a composite top 20 English cricketers in terms of mental toughness. Firstly, what was interesting was how different everyone's assessment was.
Right.
Well, that kind of reinforced my view right from the start. Out of over 100 coaches, there was only one English cricketer who featured in every single coach's top 10. One. And that was Mike Hamilton. But if you think about that, you've got 100 experienced coaches naming their top 10 mentally toughest cricketers of the previous decade, and only one person made everyone's list. That struck me as really interesting. But I thought, well, he's going to be a good place to start talking to him. And that was Mike Atherton, who'd been captain of the England cricket team. So anyway, I got this composite list, whittled it down to a top 20. Because I'd been working in cricket for a while, I had a sort of ongoing relationship with 12 of those 20 players. So conducted an in-depth interview with those 12, all about what they thought mental toughness was, where they thought their mental toughness had come from, what were the formative experiences in their career, to give them the mental toughness that they felt they had. And then those interviews generated a huge wad of data, qualitative data, which I and my research team trawled through to try and create some recurring themes, if you like, to help us understand what mental toughness was and how we could seek to develop it in younger players. And of the many things that came out of the research, the most interesting one for me was the fact that I and my research team decided, looking at all this data, that there were different types of mental toughness. And that hadn't really been talked about before. So the idea of mental toughness per se just wasn't viable. So we came up with, out of the data, these 4 different types of mental toughness. If you contrast just 2 of them, one of them we called inner drive. And that was mental toughness which was demonstrated by really high levels of commitment and dedication, the sort of work ethic, all the sacrifices that athletes make, training incredibly hard, perseverance, determination in the face of adversity, that inner motivation to be the best and everything that comes with that. But if you contrast that to what we called critical moment toughness, critical moment toughness was in the moment, that critical performance moment. Now in cricket, that would be bowling at the death in a limited overs game, for example. It might be a penalty shootout in football. It could be a golfer sinking that 6-foot putt to win the Ryder Cup. Now we called that critical moment toughness. And what we found from the data was it's perfectly conceivable that a player could be quite low in inner drive, not that dedicated, huge natural talent, but possibly quite lazy and relaxed about life, didn't train very hard. But boy, put them in that critical performance moment and they can perform, in the clutch moment, as the Americans would say. Ditto, if you flip that, we all know athletes that would have incredibly high levels of inner drive, would work every hour of the day, immense professionalism, conscientious dedication, but not good in that critical moment. So that was the first and most obvious differentiation. And then we came up with other types as well. One of them we called turnaround toughness, which is basically how quickly can you bounce back from adversity, bounce back ability, as the football managers were saying. So essentially, to cut things short, we found that there were these different types of mental toughness. Some performers had all 4. Others might have 3 out of 4. Others might have 2, might have 1, some might have none. We felt that you needed at least 2 out of the 4, to have a decent chance of performing at the top level. But the broader your mental toughness repertoire, if you like, the more likelihood of you being a real great performer. Matt, there were other things that came out of the research as well, but that was the main thing. But one other thing I've always highlighted out of the research was every one of those 12 players that I interviewed, in some way or another, when I asked them about where they thought their mental toughness came from, they would talk about some negative experience in their life or their career, some sort of adversity quite early in their career or life, that shaped them and was instrumental in developing their mental toughness, which then gave us quite an interesting question to ponder, which was, if we're looking to develop mental toughness in younger players, how do we almost like sometimes artificially manufacture negative experiences which weren't going to crush them, but were going to act as a stimulus to then developing mental toughness? And there was lots of discussion back in those days about that, which then led to what I think was some quite successful development programs for younger players.
It's fascinating, Steve, because and taking you up on that last point, definitely over the last decade, a lot of the conversation has been around. I mean, there was a bit of a seminal paper, I think it was within the last decade, the talent needs trauma paper, which is a strong way of putting it, but basically what you're saying, that piece of adversity, and definitely within academies, within a number of sports, within talent development pathways, that notion of manufacturing adversity through whether it's stretch tasks, by changing the age group dynamics, whatever it might be, seems to be something that a lot of talent development pathways are doing in order to strive to, help people, help players develop that mental toughness.
Yes, and if you go back to the research that we did, I mean, we're talking 20 years ago, this research, because I did it in around 2000, 2001. That was before academies, certainly before academies in cricket, and before we were having conversations about, player development pathways and things. So it was quite timely that the research came out then, because I think we were then able to feed it into some of the early days of these academies. The other thing that I just highlight, because it's linked with this as well, in terms of the substantial things that came out of this piece of research, was the importance of the environment, which now is very much taken for granted. I mean, everyone talks about high performance environments. I mean, that description right there, creating the high performance environment, that is part and parcel of language in the performance world now. It wasn't 20 years ago. And what we found was that the environment basically kind of trumped everything. So you could have great sports psych support, you could have great programs to educate players on mental skills, to teach them visualization and pre-performance routines and goal setting and all of these excellent mental skills that we would teach athletes. But if the environment wasn't right, if the environment wasn't strong, then I wouldn't say that stuff's a waste of time, but it's going to be exposed. So what we pushed hard for coming out of our research was, let's shift the balance away from what you might describe as conventional mental skills training, and let's put the emphasis more on creating the right environment. Get that right first, and then it's almost that the mental skills education is the added extra. It's almost the icing on the cake. But we felt that for the previous 10, 20 years, as a profession, we spent too much time just trying to do the icing. And we hadn't looked at the cake. Get the environment right. Get everything possible that you can right about the environment. Create an environment that is going to be a strong platform on which the mental skills education can sit. And we actually were quite excited about that as an output from that piece of research, because we did feel that was quite radical at the time. Although me saying it now, I'm sure to a lot of listeners that's not going to sound very radical, given the emphasis that is placed on environment these days. But it was 20 years ago.
No, it's incredible, Stephen, and you and this piece of research have left yours and its fingerprint across high performance sports, certainly in Britain, and it's heavily influential today. And I know what it's like to consult within a club, and I suppose this comes back to the integration versus isolation scenario as well, whereby I know what it's like to consult within a club or a team or an organisation, and they don't embrace that notion of the impact that the environment had. And you feel as a sports psychologist that you are swimming upstream, don't you? You kind of, because you're delivering on a one-to-one basis, you're delivering, so let's say, mental skills, and you're utilising a sports psych framework of your choice, and you're trying to help people. But ultimately, when that organisation has, let's say, a maladaptive environment and not a psychologically informed environment, it can be frustrating. But that's the metaphor I would use, is you feel like you've got to, you're swimming upstream, and it just feels like you're being pushed back all the time.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so it's a great thing.
I interviewed Dr. Mustafa Sarkar, who's doing some great work at Nottingham Trent University on resilience, and you mentioned that sort of exchange of words from mental toughness to resilience, which is maybe what we might use that term resilience today. And in episode 33 of the Sports Psych Show, Dr. Mustafa Sarkar and Clara Swedland, his research with Dr. David Fletcher at Loughborough University very much demonstrates exactly the same thing, is that this environment matters. It really does. I think a slightly selfish comment here, I find it fascinating. I have a slight interest Steve, in personality science, and I know sports psychology and personality science have a slightly uneasy relationship because ultimately sports competitors and sports participants come in all flavours of personality, right? But I find it interesting, you talked about those first two forms of mental toughness, the inner drive, the general commitment, which could potentially be correlated with the big five personality factor of conscientiousness. But then also you've got that critical moment toughness, which is in the moment, which isn't really about conscientiousness. It's not the conscientiousness to carry on, essentially. It's almost dealing with the anxiety in the moment to carry on. So I love that distinction between the two.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Just on the more general point about personality science, it's actually another learning from my own career. I wish I'd got into that side of things earlier in my career, because some of that personality science extremely helpful. And whilst it's not panacea to everything, in terms of helping people understand each other better, in particular working with coaches to help them understand their players, their athletes at a deeper level, I found that whole area of personality science immensely helpful, even though in my graduate school days I was told don't go there. But after about 10 years of my career, I decided to leave that advice where it was and have a little dabble. And the more I dabbled, the more I thought, this is good stuff. There's some really helpful stuff here. And now I would say actually that whole personality area has been one of the most impactful tools that I've had at my disposal in the second half of my career.
I think it's fascinating, and I think one of the limitations with personality science is that the level of complexity in terms of personality. I'm a big fan of Dan McAdams' work and his three levels from Northwestern University in his three levels of personality. But if nothing else, I find that we can go in one of two directions. We can say, well, we kind of know everybody's different, and personality, we kind of know personality exists, but it's not that relevant to us because everybody's different. Or we can look at the research literature and we can basically accept that there are some good frameworks out there that give us an understanding of how personality is developed by and large, and what the different areas. And I think that big five model with the optimism, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, I just think is, if nothing else, Steve, I've actually found it quite useful for myself and understanding myself and improving my ability to manage myself.
Well, ditto for me. And I found that's helped me in life generally, but certainly as a practitioner. And interesting, just to pick up on the extroversion thing, I mean, without getting into some of the finer details of the personality science area, I do passionately believe that the extroversion-introversion contrast is enormously helpful in working in sport. And I certainly, again, happy to share sort of mistakes and lessons that I've learned in my career. I wish I'd got into this earlier in my career. And I wish I'd been able earlier in my career to understand some of the points around extroversion and introversion more effectively earlier in my career, because I think that deeply affects the way in which you engage with someone, deeply affects the kind of mechanisms you would use to influence them and support them. And interestingly, just to share some stuff from my work in professional cricket, particularly male cricket, which historically was a very sort of testosterone-driven, classic alpha male type environment, take no prism. I mean, the professional cricketer's locker room, back in the 1990s was a tough place to be, particularly if you were a very strong introvert. It was a very extrovert environment. You were expected to socialize. You were expected to go out for beers. You were expected to go to team dinners the night before a big game, when as a strong introvert, all you wanted to do was hide away in your hotel room and get your mind right for the next day. No, if you did that, you were selfish, you were not a good team player. it was the environment was driven by the extroverts. And I've always maintained that there are one or two very high-profile examples of former English cricketers who I know and had the pleasure of working with later in their careers, who would have had completely different international careers if they came into the England team now, where the team environment is much more accepting of these individual differences in personality and much more accommodating of that introvert approach. And I think that's been one of the most exciting developments of the locker room environment in cricket in the last 20 odd years. So I'm all for that. I mean, without getting into it, there are other aspects of personality science that I think you can also apply. But my starting point is always extroversion, introversion.
Yeah, and as you're speaking there, I'm just thinking about some of the, and we can only hypothesize, but some of the challenges people who might record a score as on the introverted side of the scale, because obviously we've got introversion, ambiversion, which is smack bang in the middle, and extroversion, and those who do score as introverts, within a team environment, how challenging historically that may have been. And as the rise of professionalism in various sports tempered that a little bit. I mean, maybe now in cricket there's certainly social functions to go to, but because it's such a professional sport now, that it's not as expected of cricketers to do those duties.
Yeah, well, interesting. On a very practical level, one of the things that changed some time ago around the English cricket team was in the old days, you always shared a room. And then the decision was made to put more funding in whereby players had their own individual rooms. Now, that was bad news for some players, good news for others. For some of the extroverted players, they thrived on sharing a room with a teammate. At the end of the day, they can sit there and chew the fat about what's gone on, and they liked having someone around, and, that gave them energy and it gave them someone to bounce ideas around. Whereas for the introvert sharing a room, at the end of maybe a stressful day, a day that perhaps hasn't gone quite so well, they needed that quiet time on their own to do their thing, to recharge. So they were delighted when they finally got a single room. Whereas then some of the extroverts all of a sudden are put in this single room all on their own and going, they're climbing up the walls because they need that interaction. I do think we're much better at understanding that now. And if we go back to an earlier point in our conversation where we were talking about working with and through coaches, and I was making the point that as the profession of sports psychology has developed, more and more of some of the basic sports psych stuff is now covered in coach education. So coaches can now do that. And that frees up the sports psych to do other more advanced stuff. This is exactly one of those areas where I think we can now be freed up to help around personality science, because the coaches are covering some of the more conventional mental skills stuff. And because the personality science stuff does take an extra level of understanding and training and expertise, I would suggest. So that's a really good example of something that we might not have had the scope to do years ago, but we have now because the coaches are picking up the slack on some of the more basic stuff.
And last point to make here, or question to ask you, because I'm conscious of your time, and we don't want to geek out too much on this stuff. But I think this could be an interesting conversation to have in a rematch here at some point in the future. But I think you're 100% right there, and this is something I've reflected upon over the last few years as I've got more into the personality science literature, and that notion that our personality characteristics help us and hinder us. And let me park that, I'll come back to it. Our personality characteristics in many respects happen to us, and we kind of do them because there may well be a genetic component to them. And if I think, and I'm kind of thinking, I'm trying to think of a famous celebrity who could be deemed to have an extreme personality. Let's take a Roy Keane, the former Manchester United and Republic of Ireland footballer, for instance, who, and I'm going to do a naughty thing here as a sports psychologist and make assumptions, I suppose, so please excuse me. But, for me, agreeableness, the personality dimension of agreeableness, probably quite low agreeable. And in that respect, that probably really helped him, and possibly very much helped Sir Alex Ferguson, in as much as Roy Keane was a part of the fabric of Manchester United at the time when they were winning a lot. He was driving everybody. Eric Cantona as well was driving everybody. Gary Neville were driving others. But that low agreeableness is very much that competitiveness side. At the same time, low agreeableness, that characteristic can hinder people. It can get them into trouble. In those acute moments, it can get you sent off. So I think that's where, as you're saying, coaches can find that useful, because personality characteristics are complex. They help us, they hinder us, and the challenge we've got as coaches in the sporting world is personality characteristics, they kind of happen to us. We can't help them. It's who we are a lot of the time.
Agree. And the one thing I'd add to that is, and I think this is a really important message to get across to people, because people are often a bit fearful when you start a conversation about personality science, is there's no right or wrong answer on this. Yeah. It's not about a good personality and a bad personality. It's about different personalities. And you just picked up on the agreeableness theme with regard to Roy Keane. If you just flip that, I've never met Jurgen Klopp, but I'm going to guess he might well score quite high on agreeableness, but that works to his advantage. So to me, it's about self-awareness, understanding who you are and what makes you tick, and then utilizing who you are to make sure you can make your personality work effectively for you. So if you come back to the original extroversion-introversion idea, which is better? Well, neither is better. They're just different. If you're a strong extrovert, let's help you understand that, and let's help you manage that effectively so that you can be the best that you can be. Ditto for the introvert. Ditto for the ambivert, who's somewhere in the middle. But it's not like we're trying to convert people's personalities. We're trying to help them understand what makes them tick so that they can be the best they can be. And if coaches are in on that as well, all the better, I would suggest.
Love it. Steve, that time has flown by. I'm mindful of your time, and I loved our complete geek out in the last 10 minutes about personality science. That was brilliant, and gives us, as I said earlier, a good platform to have a potential Dan Abraham's Dr. Steve Ball number 2, if you're ever willing to come back on.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Dan. Thanks for the invite. Really enjoyed the conversation. We've covered a lot of areas, and it's been a real pleasure. And good luck with the podcast. Keep the good work going. It's been a real pleasure being involved.
Thanks so much, Steve. Well, everyone, that was Dr. Steve Ball, and that was awesome. I really enjoyed that. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.